This little patch of land is, how to put it, problematic? Now, among the many problems is, what do we call it? One common suggestion is to just use the ancient name, Canaan. But that begs the question of, is that the actual best ancient name? Did Canaan exist? Or maybe a better way of putting it is, did anyone in the ancient world ever actually think of themselves as a Canaanite? Let's dig in. Now, just to be clear, Canaan obviously existed. The name isn't made up, but we're interested in how it was used and to what extent it maps onto ancient identities versus to what extent it was imposed on ancient peoples. We want to know, to what does the term actually refer and how was it actually used? And once we understand that, we may be better able to ask if this is a good term we can use. And this isn't some silly semantic question. Terminology actually matters. And it's changed over time. This region is sometimes called the Middle East or the Near East, and this is still commonly used, but it lacks a bit of precision. Where does the Middle East start and stop? Is Morocco a part of the Middle East? Is Libya? The relatively new acronym MENA, Middle East and North Africa, sidesteps this discussion by lumping North African countries in with the Middle East, but this still lacks precision. Do we include Afghanistan in the MENA umbrella? Do we include Sudan? But beyond the lack of precision of the term, there's also a sense that the Near East is not here. It's not the center. The Near East is between here and the Far East, just as the Middle East is in the middle of here and the Far East. The terminology by default is Eurocentric, or more generally Western focused. So the term is regarded as too colonial and thus problematic. Whatever your perspective on colonialism, it's valid to note that the terminology sets the tone for the field, and this kind of terminology makes the region, its history, and its people, by default, foreign. The terminology can be offensive to people in that part of the world who don't see their home and heritage as ancillary to the European and American worlds. Another term that is a bit more precise that is often used is Levant. This term generally refers to the island of Cyprus, the modern countries of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. The term is French in origin, meaning rising, as in the direction of the rising sun. So while Levant is more precise, it's not necessarily less colonial. It's just somewhat disguised being in French. It still essentially just means east, and so is still identifying that region as east of here. A surprisingly well-received term by many people is that of Holy Land. This is a term that all of the Abrahamic faiths would agree on. However, it is a bit offensive to the mostly godless academics, so it hasn't fully caught on within academia. Within modern archaeological scholarship, this region is now generally called Syria-Palestine. And believe it or not, this is done to be as nonpartisan as possible. The references to Syria and Palestine are intended not to refer to the modern political entities of Syria and Palestine, but to the geographical regions bounded on the north by the Taurus Mountains, on the east by the Euphrates and the Badia al-Sham, down to the Sinai Peninsula. The terminology of Syria-Palestine is intended to be geographical, using the historically recognized boundaries of the region. However, given the trajectory of Palestinian nationalism in the last half-century and recent events, this terminology is rapidly becoming political. So scholars are looking for new terms so discussion doesn't get derailed by modern political baggage and focus can be put back onto the ancient world under discussion. Now, Syria is the less problematic term, so you'll still see use this as a geographical term. However, some scholars have reverted back to using Levant, but more specifically, the southern Levant. Even with all the baggage that term carries, many scholars prefer to try and to use Palestine as a geographical term. But some people think instead of modern terms, we should go back to ancient ones. But this isn't really done for other parts of the region. No one calls Egypt Kemet the way ancient Egyptians did. We refer to Anatolia, not Asia or Hatti. But, the logic goes, perhaps because of the modern baggage, ancient terminology would work better for this particular stretch of land. But what term would work best? Canaan is the term suggested most frequently. But when we review the sources on when and how this term was used, I think we'll find that the term evolved over time and its use is just as complicated as the other terms already in use. Now, we aren't going to review all the references to Canaan in ancient literature. It's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible something like 80 times. We will try to look at a representative sample to understand how the term was used, who used the term, and to see if we can parse out how the term changed over time. First off, the term Canaan has an uncertain origin. There are two positions that are often repeated. One, that it is Hurrian in origin, kinahu, and refers to blue dye or blue cloth. Another suggestion is that it is a Semitic term and derives from the root kana, which means to bow or to be subdued. It may be in the sense of to be low or low land, as opposed to highland or hills. The earliest undisputed reference to Canaan, or really Canaanites, comes from Mari. I will note that a term, ganana, appears in the Ebla archives from the 24th century and is sometimes cited as the first appearance of the term Canaan, but this is disputed. Still, others point to Ebla and Eblaite being among the first expressions of Canaanite as a cultural or linguistic phenomenon, though this too is disputed, as the classification of Eblaite and how Eblaite was used in the late 3rd millennium continues to be debated among scholars. But back to Mari. A letter sent from an army official to the king of Mari states, "The robber and the Canaanites dwell in Rachitsum. We and they watch one another. The army is well. Let my lord not be concerned about his army." Here the term kina'ahnu is used with the determinatives for man and plural, making it the men from Canaan, which is smoothed out to Canaanites. Interpreters agree that what is being communicated here is that an army commander is writing to the Mariot king to explain that the army of Mari was positioned in a safe place as their enemy, along with some Canaanites, were in Rachitsum and were keeping tabs on each other. Rachitsum is not positively identified, though if it is the same as the Rachitsu that is in the Amarna Letters, then it is located somewhere between Damascus and Kana. So while there are some outstanding questions, we get one data point in the 18th century that suggests Canaanites could be found between Kana and Damascus, east of the anti-Lebanon mountains. The next reference to Canaan comes from the 15th century at Alalakh in the Idrimi inscription. This is a well-known inscription and artifact that we won't detail in full here. We will only note that the protagonist, Idrimi, was a prince in Aleppo who was forced out after his father was displaced by the king of Mitanni, and after a brief exile in Imar with his mother's family, we read, "I set out the next day. I went to the land of Canaan. The town of Amiyah is situated in the land of Canaan. In the town of Amiyah live citizens of Halab, Mukish, Nia, and Nuhashe. When they saw that I was their lord's son, they gathered around me. I have become chief. I have been appointed." Whether or not the historical details of this story are nonfiction or exaggerated, we are largely safe in assuming the geographical details reflect the reality of the 15th century. And so we get another data point showing Canaan was a place and that Amiyah is a place within Canaan. And Amiyah has been identified with the modern locality of Amun in Lebanon, west of the Lebanon mountains. And this Amiyah appears in other texts from Alalakh. In AT 181, we find a census list of armed men. It lists 20 personal names and their place of origin. One is labeled Sharniya, a Canaanite, while another is noted as Azira from the town of Amiyah. So although Amiyah is known to be in Canaan, even in literature from Alalakh, Azira is not called a Canaanite, while other men contemporary with Azira could be called Canaanite. Alalakh tablet 154 also lists several names. One phrase on the tablet states, "owner of a chariot," so the tablet may list men who were aristocratic. We don't know if all of the men listed owned chariots, but one of the men listed is stated to be a Canaanite. Still, another tablet at Alalakh provides a list of households. One column lists household of commoners, a term derived from the word for poor, and one of these households belongs to Luchasha, the Canaanite. Some of the places named are difficult to locate, but we understand from Alalakh that Canaan was a recognized place, that some places could be found in it, but people from Canaan were not always identified as Canaanite, or were not primarily identified as Canaanite all the time. Just down the coast and dated to a century or two later are two specific inscriptions from Ugarit. The first is a list of merchants. There are several men who are named with either a place of origin, a patronymic, or an ethnonym. There is Riyanu from Ashdod, and Namanu, an Egyptian, and then there is Ya'ilu, a Canaanite. Another document, a judicial decision, deals with two separate groups of people, the sons of Ugarit and the sons of Canaan. This judicial text is a copy of what was sent to Egypt, as Pharaoh was considered the overlord of the Canaanites, and so he had to be properly informed of the decision of the king of Ugarit. Both of these texts have been used to support the idea that Ugarit did not consider itself to be a part of Canaan, and that the Canaanites were foreigners in Ugarit. The first text is also significant because it is one of the few texts where we may interpret a person as self-identifying as a Canaanite, though this requires some inferences which may not be accurate. The suggestion is that this is a list of individuals who are being reported, possibly to a customs official working for the state of Ugarit. What is assumed is that these men came into port and had to identify who they were, and the port workers recorded how they identified themselves, in which case Ya'ilu identified himself as a Canaanite. And while this may be a logical Sitzim Laban for this text, it's not certain and so remains speculative. One Hittite text records an evocation ritual, meant to draw the gods back to Hatti, where the diviners doing the rituals address the gods. Wherever ye may be, O cedar gods, whether in heaven or on earth, whether on mountains or in rivers, whether in the Mitanni country or in the country of Kinza, the country of Tunip, the country of Ugarit, the country of Zinzira, the country of Dumpapa, the country of Idarukata, the country of Gatana, the country of Alalakh, the country of Kinahi, and then continues to list dozens of other countries. Another Hittite document has a very similar list, suggesting that list was formulaic. And from these documents, we can map Canaan into the Hittite world and deduce it was bounded by Amurru and Kinza in the north and Sidon in the south. There are several references to Canaan in Egyptian sources, notably the Amarna Letters, which further clarify some things for us. But the first reference predates the Amarna era and is a list of captives taken by Amenhotep II. The text lists 640 Canaanites taken as captive. Another list mentions captives from Retenu, Karu, and Nuhasha, as well as Apiru and Shasu captives. These two lists are understood by Egyptologists to be two parts of a single summary of Amenhotep's campaign. If this is the case, Canaanites are distinguished from Hurrians and people from Nuhasha, and Canaan was likely the area around Kantna, Kadesh, and Labwa. There are other references to Canaan in Egyptian sources, but the Amarna archive has our most illuminating sources. EA8 is a letter from the king of Babylon. In it, he complains to Pharaoh that his merchants were detained in Canaan and killed. He is writing the letter to Pharaoh because Canaan is your country and its kings are your servants. In EA9, the king of Babylon is attempting to forestall Egypt from opening up diplomatic relations with Assyria, as Assyria was a vassal of Babylon, and thus it would be inappropriate for Egypt to establish ties with Assyria. The Babylonian king tells a story of how in the past, all the Canaanites wrote to the king of Babylon and asked for diplomatic ties to support their independence from Egypt. Babylon reminded the pharaoh that his ancestor denied this request and that the current situation with Assyria is no different. And while the geopolitics here are interesting in their own right, we see that from the Babylonian perspective, Canaan was a patchwork of kings but capable of corporate action, all while being fully within the orbit of Egypt. EA30 is considered a passport. It is written for a Mitannian official traveling to Egypt. The official carried it from Mitanni to Egypt, where it was deposited. It was meant to ensure the official could continue without being assaulted or withheld by the kings of Canaan, who were servants of Pharaoh. This suggests Canaan was understood as being fully under Egyptian control. EA36 is a letter from the king of Alashia. It is too fragmentary for a clear translation, but words have been translated even if they don't have a great context. For example, the province of Canaan has been read in this tablet, though the reading is disputed. EA162 is a letter from the pharaoh to Aziru, a former vassal of Egypt who is in open rebellion. The pharaoh threatens Aziru and warns that if he would just do his vassal obligation, he will be fine. However, you yourself know that the king does not fail when he rages against all of Canaan. The threat here relies on Amurru being considered a part of Canaan. There are several letters between Egypt and the king of Byblos which mention Canaan. Some are too fragmentary to derive much more than references to Canaan, but in at least 2, the king warns Pharaoh that he needs to act because if the king neglects his city, all of the cities of Canaan, not one will be his. It would seem the king of Byblos is warning that the entire Asiatic empire is at risk of revolt if Pharaoh does not act soon. In a letter from the king of Tyre, the king uses Canaan and the land of the king as synonyms. In another letter from the same city, the king is giving an intelligence report, or at least the recent news or gossip from the region. He quotes the pharaoh's instructions, "Write to me what you have heard from Canaan," and then begins talking about the succession in Danuna, a place not definitively identified, then troubles in Ugarit, a place we know did not identify as Canaan or Canaanites, then about Aziru and Kadesh, who Pharaoh did consider to be a part of Canaan, before finally complaining about his rival in nearby Sidon. So while he was instructed to write a report about Canaan, the Tyrian king reports some gossip from far-flung regions, reporting on events closer and closer to home. What is relevant for us is that the king of Tyre felt comfortable including Ugarit and even places farther afield in his report on Canaan, even if those places would not see themselves as part of Canaan. In other later Egyptian sources, we see references to Pa-Canaan. In a relief dated to the reign of Seti I, a city is shown under siege, and there's an inscription that calls it the city or town of Canaan, or Pa-Canaan. Early interpreters suggested this may be Gaza. That interpretation has been taken as gospel, and so Pa-Canaan has at times been taken to be synonymous with the city of Gaza, an important Egyptian stronghold in their Asiatic empire. The last stop on the way of Horus leading out of Egypt and into the Asiatic empire. However, the city in the relief doesn't need to be Gaza. In fact, nothing about the relief even indicates that it is. It certainly could be, and the original interpreter who originally suggested it could be Gaza is still non-committal about it. Now, some Egyptologists are far more certain that Pa-Canaan is Gaza, in which case using Canaan would certainly not be less political in the modern era. But again, not all Egyptologists accept this equation. Pa-Canaan and Gaza are both mentioned in the Papyrus Anastasi I inscription, and to some interpreters have cited this as further evidence of an equivalence. However, this again is not required. The text lists several places and geographical markers which are considered to be a part of the land of Canaan, suggesting it extended up to Sumer and Kadesh in Lebanon, down to the coast and the Jordan River. In the famed Merneptah stela, the son of Ramses the Great records a victorious campaign into a region he calls Canaan. At the end of the inscription on the stela is a poetic victory hymn. It has a chiastic structure showing Canaan is paralleled with Karu. The poem moves from the extremities, Libya and Anatolia, to the areas more directly under Egypt's influence with the specific list of cities and people, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and a people he calls Israel, all of which are, based on the literary structure, to be included within Canaan. Finally, we see dozens of references to Canaan, the land of Canaan, and Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible. It's relatively uncontroversial to say the Hebrew Bible is an Iron Age document. It is a collection of texts which were collected and edited sometime in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. It no doubt included source materials from earlier in the Iron Age, but which passages date to when specifically is not a knot that we're going to try to untangle here. Suffice it to say, the text does record relevant information for earlier in the Iron Age and is not entirely a fabrication of the Hellenistic period, as some scholars have argued. As for Canaan, in general we see Canaanite used as an ethnonym in a stereotyped list that usually includes a subset of Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Passages like Numbers 13 spell out that the Canaanites were those who lived in the lowlands, while others, like the Amorites, lived in the hill country. But other passages refer to a land called Canaan. We even see several passages which outline what places are included in Canaan. But the Bible seems to have several perceptions of Canaan which are used at various points. One is Canaan as the Promised Land, which extended from Lebo Hamath in the north down to the Dead Sea. Another iteration of Canaan was limited to what we may call the Phoenician coast, that is, territory between the sea and the Lebanon mountains. A few limited passages, namely in Zephaniah, seem to place Canaan on the Philistine coastline. So where does all of this leave us? What was Canaan? There are a few different ways of thinking of Canaan and the Canaanites. First, Canaan is a geographical term, but what it referred to changed over time and seemingly varied from place to place. Prior to the Amarna period, we don't have enough real data points to paint a particularly helpful picture other than that it was a region between Amiru and Kadesh in the north and Sidon in the south. It was inhabited, including by urban areas, but was not dominated by any one city and had no real sense of political unity. It's postulated that the term Canaan was made to distinguish between the settled urbanites and the semi-nomadic pastoralists. Canaan seems to refer to the Bekaa Valley and areas west of the Lebanon Mountains originally, and doesn't explicitly include urban peoples. It may have been a term used by pastoralists to refer to the land they used that was in between the settled centers. It was a relatively limited area when it was first used. But Canaan expanded due to Egyptian imperialism. It is again suggested Egyptians first heard the term after they campaigned into Syria or established commercial ties with Byblos. Egypt heard the term from the locals but lacked the geographical expertise to delineate specifically what it did and did not refer to, so the term became used in a much more expansive way. Eventually, it came to be associated with Egypt's Asiatic imperial holdings, which became normative through Egyptian diplomatic correspondence. In the following Iron Age, Canaan was no longer Egypt's imperial reach in Asia, but was the Lebanese coastline, what the Greeks called Phoenicia. But how precise of a term this is a matter of some debate among scholars. While there is, as we've seen, solid evidence for Canaan as a vaguely defined geographical location, it's been argued that this vagueness in the terminology suggests no one actually ever thought of themselves as Canaanite. As we mentioned, we only have one real possible case of someone self-identifying as a Canaanite in the historical record, and that's not even certain. Niels Peter Lemche has argued no one thought of themselves as a Canaanite, arguing that as the term is used today as an ethnic or national identifier is simply not how it was ever used in the ancient world, that Canaan was only ever a geographical term. He pushes the evidence perhaps too far in places, suggesting to the scribe of the ancient Western Asia, Canaanite always designated a person who did not belong to the scribe's own society or state, while Canaan was considered to be a country different from his own. These ideas were countered in articles by Anson Rainey and Nadav Naaman, who argued that Lemche had an inadequate understanding of the textual sources, a critique which I believe is valid. And they offered counter-arguments, suggesting that people in Canaan used it as a political and territorial phrase from time to time. This to me seems like a fair characterization. And geographical terms can change over time. This isn't particularly controversial. But the evidence that Canaanite was ever a primary identification of people who lived in Canaan isn't particularly strong. The evidence points more towards the practice of identifying as Canaanite when traveling outside of Canaan. People within Canaan, it seems, had different ways of identifying themselves. Patronymics were common, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, as was identifying the town or city one was from. In fact, the city or city-state appears to be the most proximate political identifier, not the imperial Canaan or Canaanite. Other scholars have identified Canaan and Canaanite as referring to a shared cultural or linguistic world. This removes the term from geography and politics and makes it a socio-linguistic category. Canaanites are just people who share a particular cultural identity and shared a common linguistic heritage, even if they had a variety of political or even what we may call ethnic identities. Archaeological excavations confirm a shared cultural milieu from the Middle Bronze Age through the Late Bronze Age. There was shared cultic architecture, a shared pantheon and mythic tradition, common ceramic traditions suggesting similar foodways and agricultural practices. These all attest to a common Canaanite cultural world. But returning to our original dilemma of finding a term that is non-political or even just non-colonial, we may find that Canaan is no less political or colonial than the other terms. The biblical evidence uses Canaanite almost as a pejorative. So is Canaan a better term to use than any of the available terminology? Maybe, but I don't really think so. The ancient evidence shows that Canaan was never simple. What Canaan was shifted. Its meaning depended on who was speaking, and it seems very few people ever claimed it as their primary identification. But modern terms aren't much better. Syria-Palestine, Levant, even Near East all come with their own baggage. The reality is that naming this region has always been complicated. As we talk about this part of the world, we always want to try and be respectful of the people who live there and the people who made it into the world that it is today.